So my name is Mirian Vilela. I'm the Executive Director of the Earth Charter International Secretariat, which is located in Costa Rica, where we have a center on education for sustainability.
My name is Maria Lydia Marco Tulli, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Pacifica Graduate Institute and an advisor at the Earth Charter Institute in Costa Rica. Welcome. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your lecture that you're going to be giving on Tuesday here at Pacifica, and if you could just give us some highlights.
Well, we are going to be reflecting a little bit about the Earth Charter as the humanity's shared values. The promise of the Earth Charter as not only this document that encapsulates humanity's shared values, but also the Earth Charter as a movement that empowers various actors from various spheres of society. But we are going to look at that from an angle of governance. What is good governance and what is bad governance? I think this is certainly one of the challenges of nowadays, because governance is not really only about governments. Governments is one entity that helps us in principle to organize communities and countries. But governance has to do with the way in which decisions are made. Governance has to do with the rules and policies and how those rules and policies are made, are developed. So I think that over the past 20 years, there have been a shift in the understanding of how decisions are made. History has shown us that in the past, it was much easier to have an authoritarian, vertical ways of making decisions. That's not the case anymore, right? But despite that fact, nobody knows exactly what are the proper processes of making decisions for a community, for an institution, or for a country, because there are so many voices. There's such a challenge to articulate the voices, but also to engage people in the process, that I think various groups are hustling with that question of participatory governance, sustainability governance, or good governance, no matter how we want to call that. I would speak maybe the examples of a few places such as Mexico or Brazil, that we look at processes that are opening for the engagement of non-state actors to help making decisions. So for instance, to give you a very concrete example, in the southern part of Brazil and in some other cities, there is an initiatives for participatory budgeting. So there's a budget for the local community, or the municipality has a budget that normally who makes the decision about how that budget is going to be spent. Normally is the municipality on their own. But there's a growing movement, I would say, that offers a certain percentage of the public funding to the community, and asking the question, okay, out of this whole budget we have, 10%, how does the community would like us to spend this public funding? That's an example of participatory / good governance. Why? Because by engaging people in a discussion, in a dialogue, rather than making decisions closed and centralized in a place, we immediately have an added value with different views, with more information about what are the real priorities. But we also have the sense of ownership and commitment from the people who are immediately engaging in the process to make things happen and to bring their own contribution to the process. So just to give you this as a very glimpse of an example, and by saying that there are different processes, different ways in which an institution or a country or a local community can open up the process to engage society. One way could be by just consulting. So we invite all of you to come and just give us ideas, but a centralized, smaller group would make the decision. So it has a consultative status, just to consult, not to share the decision-making process itself. Another level is a fully shared decision-making process by asking different actors of that community to come together, collaborate for the betterment of the collective. This kind of processes, of course, take significant more time. It also requires significant capacity to listen, and listening time, flexibility, that a lot of our leaders are not used to. Because it requires a whole learning process to learn how to be flexible, to be patient with time, and to listen. But good governance processes requires those qualities in a leader, but also in a process. Yeah. So by having a process that requires more time, might not be easy to accept for short-sighted processes or people. But it will generate, I would say, many more positive outcomes, even though it requires more time. And it will generate more positive outcomes because precisely you have more voices being engaged. And it's like, actually, let's take the example of the Earth Charter.
Which is what I was almost going to point out, because you know it's possible since the Earth Charter almost did the same thing,
yes,
right?
Yes.
You have multiple voices coming together.
It requires time. Mm-hmm. In one way, the difference here is that we could put together a number of world leaders, experts in international environmental law or scientists in a room and say, okay, you have 1 year to develop a new charter for Earth, and get them to talk and give their inputs and etc. Or even you have 1 month to develop that. It's easier in the sense that you have the greatest minds putting their minds together and developing that and so forth. But you normally don't necessarily have the buy-in from the larger group. Mm-hmm. But by engaging the larger group, you need more time, more flexibility, more capacity to listen and to respect. So the Earth Charter, the drafting process of the Earth Charter itself could be considered or seen as an example of participatory governance and good governance. But because it was a process that was based on a multicultural and multi-sectoral dialogue over a long period of time. And because of that, you have an enriched process by having various voices, but again, you also have the buy-in of people that feel the sense of ownership to that process. So coming back to other spheres, an institution, it's very hard from the CEO of a company or the president or rector of a university to make a decision in a centralized way and have that decision being implemented in the various spheres of that realm of institution. Whereas if that's one way of making decisions. So there's a centralized decision and everybody does it. So it's a vertical way of doing that. Another way of making, which you can encounter a lot of difficulties to implement, even if you are the leader of that institution. I would say that it was easier maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But I think the world has changed. People are more educated. People are used to have their spaces to offer their voices and concerns to share. So it's not as simple as I think it used to be 50 years ago for the CEO of a company, or for the rector of a university, or even for the president of a country, because the world has become less vertical and more horizontal, more decentralized. Even though sometimes we think decision-making processes are concentrated at the high levels, it's not. So I think the whole process is here, coming from the Earth Charter, liberation theology, is an invitation for us to shift our mindset in terms of where does decision come from? Who makes the decisions? Who has the power to influence the decision-making process? By shifting away this notion that all the answers for the problems will come from the top, or all the decisions for whatever needs to be made needs to come from the top. It's like shifting away our eyes from that top to a more horizontal way. Well, no, actually, the solution for our issues needs to come from in a horizontal way.
Beyond governance, are you going to be addressing social movements, and which ones?
Yes. Well, this is certainly a topic that fascinates me. Starting from this UN sphere, I would say that UN has changed quite a lot in terms of how it is open to the voices of people, more than the voices, not only the voices of member states and governments, but also various groups of interests. And this is something relatively new, again. It's only there, I would say, increasingly more since '92. The Earth Summit was really a historical moment in this, in terms of empowering non-state actors to influence changes in society. Before the 90s, in the 80s, there were very few spaces in which society would have the opportunity to influence decision-making, and there is more and more since the Earth Summit in '92, spaces for society to influence decision-making, but also contribute not only to the decision-making process, but also to the implementation of that. And I think that's fascinating to see how this whole process is evolving, that is more and more generating social movements, not only to influence decision-making at the UN and the government's level, but also social movements to self-organize societies in what we think is important. So I mentioned this from the UN level, but I could certainly refer to the case of Brazil, because I'm Brazilian. And until the late 80s, Brazil was living in a military regime, so very authoritarian decision-making processes and etc. at the governmental level. And in the 90s, the society started to awaken, slowly and slowly, and more and more the civil society in Brazil have become sophisticated in the sense of, well, actually the power is not only there, the power is everywhere. If we are able to get our acts together, if we're able to dialogue, talk, and join forces. So the social movements that took place in Brazil in June last year was a wonderful example of this emerging notion of civil society and participatory governance. What has happened there? This was 2013. So at the beginning of 2013, the Brazilian government had a significant level of public support, like high percentage. I can't remember exactly the figures, but let's say 70% of public support for the government. Why? Because, well, society would see that government was investing in social programs, There were significant people really, literally, and for real, getting out of the levels of poverty. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's about 30 million people in Brazil over the past 6 years getting out of poverty. That's something significant, right? So the government was receiving significant public support. But this was between February 2013, 70% more or less of public support, falling to 30% in June of the same year. So a very short period of something has happened that public support fell, and fell down precisely because I think people wanted to show the government that we wanted more participation. Society wanted more transparency, more control over corruption, and above all, the voices of society to be heard and really concretely be reflected in the decision-making process of the government. So society got together, and in Brazil they called it the giant has awakened. The giant is the forces of 200 million people who were sleeping as long as everything was more or less okay. And the giant awakened when the society looked around and said, okay, no, how can we get our acts together here with various groups of interest, various regions of the country, and join forces in a few simple requests for the government. So millions of people went to the streets in June 2013, to the point that the president had to respond to that, right? It was a kind of a movement to shake the government by having millions of people on the streets in various cities in the country. So we have been analyzing, okay, why a government that has so much support at the beginning of the year, 4 to 5 months later, this whole support forms. And one of the reasons that society wants to be, wants really to make sure that their concerns are heard and reflected in a concrete way. So that makes the job of leaders in our governments a little bit more complicated. If they are authoritarian leaders that are not able to enter into a dialogue, or they are not able to listen to the different voices, they will have a difficult time. They could have the formal position as leaders of authority, but not necessarily have the public support, which would make their job much more difficult. And I say this from a country level, but it could also function from a company or any institution. The importance to shift away this notion as a leader that has the power concentrated to another vision of a leader who is serving and who is facilitating and who is engaging with the community that they are supposed to serve, rather than community is there to serve them. They are there to serve the community and more to act as a facilitator. So good governance is of course very related to social movement and to the notion of liberation theology, which is really spaces to strengthen and foster dialogue and empowerment of the various groups.
So I want to ask you, what is the role of psychology or depth psychology today, in society?
Yeah. I think to help us go in depth and to understand, or maybe to help us in these processes to shift our mental models to what really matters in our lives, to shift our help, I would say, because as the Earth Charter articulates this notion that human development, once you have met your basic needs, of water, shelter, clothing, education, what is success? What is human development? Is it about having more, a better job, a bigger house, a more car, more capacity to travel, or more degrees, having more? Or is it being more, being a better human being, seeking to really change these mental models that the most important thing would be not to have, in terms of having success in life, is not a material life, but a life of service to the common good. So this required a shift of mental models that the world and the knowledge of psychology could help inform, I would say, how processes of behavior change can take place.
You spoke yesterday at the Eco-Psychology Conference about consumerism and also about personal responsibility. That with knowledge comes a larger personal responsibility. Maybe you could speak just briefly about that. And,
yes, yeah. Well, within the Earth Charter, there is a notion of universal responsibility, at the same time as common but differentiated responsibility. Responsibility with what? Responsibility with the common good, yeah? We all here, and the hope is that we are all having a sort of consciousness that we are here also to leave good footprints in our path. So the question is, what is the kind of footprint each one of us will leave on our path in this world? And to have this sense of care and responsibility that the footprint that I want to leave is going to be positive and is going to be enriching and is going to be better for the betterment of the place where I am. So the notion of universal responsibility should instill in us as humans the responsibility of caring and helping for the collective of society or humanity. The difference between that and differentiated responsibility, which is articulated in Principle 2B of the Earth Charter, is that the level of responsibility varies with regard, depending on the level of capacity you have to respond to an issue, which means that the more you know, the more you have, in terms of the more capacity you have, the more responsibility you have to address a given issue than someone else that has less capacity, less knowledge, and less capacity to influence a process. So there are two notions here. One is universal responsibility, and another one is common but differentiated responsibility. And in terms of the question on consumerism is what kind of sense of responsibility that our schools or our universities or through community psychology we can instill in people as consumers. The bigger of a consumer I am, the bigger responsibility I have to contribute back to the common good of global society.
This has been a really wonderful conversation. I really thank you for coming to Pacifica all the way from Costa Rica.
Yes.
So thank you, Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I was very happy also to learn from this beautiful environment of Santa Barbara that has beautiful sky, sun, weather, in between the mountains and the Pacific Ocean. A perfect way to instill the sensibility in all of us through this beauty.